All right, let's go ahead and get into our Plantae kingdom. We're going to be focusing on the different categories and groupings of plants, those that are fruiting plants versus flowering versus cone bearing, trees versus grasses. So a lot of different categories we're going to be getting into. So let's go ahead and get started with this. First of all, we know that the plants are members of the Plantae kingdom. They are eukaryotic. Remember that means that they contain a nucleus. They have organelles. They are multicellular. They are also photosynthetic, and remember that it's the chloroplasts that allow them to be photosynthetic. Their cell walls are made of cellulose. All of the chloroplasts, remember, all of the chloroplasts of a plant are going to be contained within its leaves. So trees, that's easy to identify the leaves, but say grasses, sometimes it's hard, but the actual leaf of the grass is the grass part that you see growing. The vein that you see growing would be where the chloroplasts are located. All right, so let's get just a brief rundown about the history of plants. We know that early life started out in aquatic environments. Algae, which we've talked about, our protists, were the first ones to photosynthesize and produce oxygen. We do know that our true plants, through fossil identification, were dependent on water for life cycle processes for reproduction. It was about quite a bit of time before plants were able to adapt to be able to move onto land and favor land biomes. Okay, they were able to adapt to become more resistant to the sun, to the rays of the sun. They were able to adapt to the conditions of being able to find water, and when they found water, they were able to conserve that water. Now our plants. Let's look at our big categories. Excuse me, our categories of our plants. We have mosses, we have ferns, we have our conifers, our flowering plants. And what we're going to be looking at is we're going to be looking at these four major categories of plants, looking at mosses and our ferns, which are both spore-producing plants versus our seed-bearing plants, which would be our conifers and flowering plants. Okay, so let's get over into start looking at these classifications. There are three major groups, or plants can be broken down based on these characteristics: the ability to conduct water, how water can flow from one part of the plant to the other. Do they produce seeds? Do they not produce seeds? Or are they flowering plants? So here we go. This water conducting tissue, one of the categories that help us categorize plants. Plants need to be able to conduct or pass water from the water source where they absorb or obtain water to other parts of the plant. Okay, so we call this tissue that allows water flow, we call it vascular tissue. So a plant that does not contain vascular tissue or water or tissue that allows for water conduction is going to be called a non-vascular plant. Okay, the actual plant tissue that is vascular tissue is known as, we call it xylem and phloem, and we'll get into those a little bit later. But these are the two types of tissue that are found in plants that have the ability to transport water from their roots to the other places within the plant. So non-vascular plants won't have xylem and phloem. They don't have vascular tissue. Then our plants that do contain xylem and phloem, they do contain this tissue that allows them to transport water throughout the plant. They're called vascular plants. Think about the sequoia trees, okay, up in the northwest part of the U.S. Those trees are hundreds of feet tall. Water has to move from the roots within the ground to the hundreds of feet up into the air where the leaves are, and then everywhere in between. And the only way that they can do that is those particular trees are part of the vascular plant category. They have xylem and phloem that allows for water nutrients to flow. All right, let's focus on our non-vascular plants now. Our non-vascular plants, they can photosynthesize, but they can't grow very far away from the ground because they don't have a way to transport water up against gravity. So they're going to spread, okay, across the ground, and they have to be close to water for reproductive purposes. They will mainly get their water and nutrients through osmosis and diffusion. Okay, they don't have a lot of root networks to allow for water uptake. And then once again, they don't have the vascular material, that xylem and phloem, to allow them to transport water. So they use a lot of osmosis and diffusion to obtain the water that they need. I mentioned that the vascular tissue in question is called xylem and phloem. Xylem is the tissue that transports water up from the roots. Phloem is going to be the vascular tissue that transports nutrients from the leaves down to the rest of the plant, and then whenever carbon dioxide or whenever oxygen is produced, oxygen then would be released back up through the phloem to the leaves for release. Okay, so that's your two big vascular tissues, your xylem and phloem. And our non-vascular plants don't have those. Now, vascular plants have the ability to transport water. They have the ability to live far distances away from a large water source. So they don't have to be like in a lake or near a lake or pond or say the ocean because of their ability to store water as well. But let's get back to our non-vascular plants. Let's look at some examples. The Hepatophyta is a class of non-vascular plants, so they don't have xylem and phloem. They grow close to the ground. They're really small. Okay, they cannot grow up against gravity. An example would be liverworts. They don't produce seeds. They produce spores. Okay, so they don't produce seeds. They're non-vascular. It's found in areas like the Arctic and Antarctica. Okay. Another class would be your Anthocerophytes, that's a hard word to say, or your hornworts. Okay. Once again, they produce using spores. They don't use seeds. They are non-vascular, so they don't contain xylem and phloem. Your Bryophytes, these are your common mosses. So usually when we think of non-vascular plants, we think of mosses because that's a very common, very large amount of our non-vascular plants are going to be our Bryophytes, our common mosses. Once again, non-vascular. They don't have xylem and phloem. They don't produce seeds. They use rhizoids. Here's our first look at organisms that use rhizoids that is similar to what, say, a fungus uses. The fungus uses mycelium, but they use rhizoids as anchors, okay, to attach to rocks and to soil for nutrient gathering. But they spread, like all of our non-vascular plants. They spread, like in this picture. Okay, they're not going to grow up against gravity. They're actually going to spread across the ground. Okay, is how they grow. Our Xylophyta, okay, these are going to be our whisk ferns. These ferns are leafless. They don't have any roots or leaves, no roots or leaves. Our Xylophyta, though, are going to be vascular. They're going to produce with spores, though. Our Lycophytas are our club mosses. Okay, our club mosses are vascular. They don't produce with seeds. They produce with spores again. So what we're just looking at as we look through these is we're just looking at some examples. Okay, examples of our we're starting out with the basic or rudimentary type of plants, and then we'll increase as we go to the more complex. Our Sphenophyta are horsetails, vascular non-seeds. Okay, our Pterophytas, which are our ferns. This is our class of ferns. Our ferns are vascular. Okay, our ferns produce using spores. Their leaves are called fronds. They're divided into leaflets. So you can see that one whole structure here is a frond, and then they have little leaflets on the frond, and then this is where the spores will be contained through, or the sporophytes will be produced when you have germination and reproductive cycles of our ferns. Okay, so that was we went pretty quick through our very basic non-vascular rudimentary plants, non-seed bearing plants, into our very basic vascular, still non-seed bearing plants, all our spore bearing plants. But now let's get to our plants with seeds. Okay, all plants that produce seeds are going to be vascular. What we just looked at are all the plants that don't use seeds. They don't produce with seeds, they reproduce using spores. Most of them are non-vascular, but there are a few that were vascular. But all of our seed-bearing plants are going to be vascular. The seed part of the reproductive system of a seed-bearing plant allows those type of plants to live in dry environments. They do not have to live in moist, wet conditions. So all of the plants that we've looked at so far, they have to be close to a water source, okay? Because they need spores they need water for their reproductive spores, their sporangia. Whereas our seed-bearing plants, they don't. They can actually use seeds as their reproductive processes and be actually in a dry environment. The seed of a seed-bearing plant is the embryo of that particular plant and a food supply for the embryo. Okay, that's what the seed is made of. The food supply is going to provide nourishment as the plant grows until leaves are produced, and once leaves are produced, then they can go through photosynthesis. But that is the makeup of a seed. And we'll get into the details of seeds a little bit later. Let's see, the seed also provides protection. The seed can actually last through very dry, dormant periods to where there is not conducive systems for growth. But eventually, once it finds those right conditions, it'll be able to grow. Seeds are easily dispersed. The reason why seeds need to be dispersed is because that will decrease the competition between the parent plant that produces those seeds and the offspring. For example, apple tree. All right, inside the apples are the seeds. Well, those seeds, if the apple tree were to if the seeds were to try to grow where they fell from the apple tree, that would increase competition for water and nutrients and sunlight in that area. So one big thing that we'll get to later and look at, how seeds get dispersed, is very important because that does help reduce that competition, allow for these plants that produce seeds to thrive. There are two big categories of our seed-bearing plants, our gymnosperms and angiosperms. Then we can further break down our gymnosperms and angiosperms to whether or not they produce flowers. Now, a gymnosperm is a plant that produces its seed directly on the surface of cones. So you've seen any type of cone-bearing tree, that would be a gymnosperm. The seeds of that particular tree or plant are going to be found within that cone or on the surface of that cone. Where our angiosperms, this is a group of our seed-bearing plants that their seeds are going to be found within a fruit. Okay, the fruit is going to be like the embryo of the plant, and then within that embryo is the seed. The fruit is going to be the nourishment for that seed. Okay, so the apple, the whole purpose of an apple is the meat of the apple that we would eat. That part is going to provide the nourishment or the nutrients for the seeds within to grow and germinate and eventually produce a new apple tree. So angiosperms produce fruits, and inside those fruits would be the seeds, and then gymnosperms produce cones.